She was 61 years old, recently widowed, and standing alone in a field with a horse that had put 3 grown men in the hospital. Nobody called the vet. Nobody called animal control. Nobody even walked close to the fence anymore. But she walked straight through the gate. And what happened next? Nobody in that county has stopped talking about it since. Before we get into this story, I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do something that made absolutely no sense? Something that looked like pure foolishness from the outside, and then realized later that they were the only one who truly understood what was happening? Because that's exactly what this is. A widow, a wild stallion, and a choice that divided an entire community right down the middle. Some people called her reckless. Some called her broken by grief and not thinking straight. And a small few, a very small few, called her the bravest person they'd ever seen. I want to know what you think. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. And after you hear this story, tell me, would you have opened that gate? Hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and let's get into it, because this one is going to stay with you. The town of Harlan Creek, Montana, sits at the edge of a landscape that hasn't made up its mind between beauty and punishment. The mountains in the distance look like something painted by a man who wanted to remind you how small you are. The wind comes in from the north without apology. The winters are the kind that make people question choices their grandparents made 3 generations back. It is not an easy place to live, but the people who stay, and most of them stay, have a particular kind of stubbornness that they wear like a coat of arms. Willa Garnett had lived in Harlan Creek for 37 years. She had not been born there. She had arrived at 24, newly married to a man named Boyd Garnett, who ran a modest cattle operation on 400 acres of mixed grass and creek bottom. Boyd was quiet in the way that good men often are, not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed most things were better demonstrated than spoken. They had 2 children, both grown now and living in other states. They had a marriage that was not perfect and not dramatic, which is to say, it was the kind of marriage that holds. Boyd died in February, a heart attack, sudden, no warning, no goodbye. He was in the barn at 5 in the morning, the way he had been every morning for 37 years, and then he wasn't. Willa found him. She did not talk about that part. She did not talk about much of anything for the first 2 months. She moved through the house and the property like a woman learning to exist in a country whose language she did not speak. The neighbors checked in. The church ladies brought casseroles. Her daughter Nadine flew out from Portland and stayed for 2 weeks and cried more than Willa did, which embarrassed them both. When Nadine left, Willa was alone. The cattle operation had been sold months before Boyd died. A practical decision they had made together when his knees got bad and the margins got worse. What remained of the property was the house, the barn, 3 pastures, and 4 horses that Boyd had kept not for any economic reason, but because he loved them. 2 mares, a gelding, and the one that nobody talked about without lowering their voice. His name, according to the papers, was Crestfall, but nobody in Harlan Creek called him that. They called him what he was. A problem. Crestfall was a black Andalusian cross, somewhere between 9 and 10 years old, 16 hands tall, and had been surrendered to Boyd 18 months before his death by a trainer outside Billings, who described him in writing as unmanageable. Boyd had taken him in the way Boyd took most things, without a great deal of explanation to anyone, including Willa. He just needs time, Boyd had said. That horse nearly broke a man's collarbone last Tuesday, Willa had replied. He needs more time. Boyd had been the only person Crestfall would allow within 20 feet. And even then, allow was a generous word. The horse tolerated Boyd. There was no softness in his eyes, no leaning into a hand. He was coiled and present and deeply uninterested in becoming anything other than what he was. But Boyd would go to that pasture every single evening, stand at the fence, and simply be there. Sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He never told Willa what he was doing. She never asked. After Boyd died, Crestfall stood at the far end of the east pasture and did not move toward the fence for anyone. The neighboring rancher, a man named Cutler, offered to haul the horse to a facility in Billings. Two other men, Voss and Radford, brothers who ran horses themselves, came by to assess the situation and left quickly, both of them with their hands in their pockets and their eyes somewhere else. "That animal's going to hurt somebody," Cutler said. "Or himself, probably both." Willa thanked him and said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 3 weeks. And then, on a Tuesday morning in April, she walked through the gate of the East pasture alone. Word travels fast in small places, and in Harlan Creek it travels faster than most. By that afternoon, half the town seemed to know that Willa Garnett had gone into the pasture with the black horse. The versions varied. In one, she had nearly been trampled. In another, she had stood calmly in the center of the field for 40 minutes while the horse circled her. In a third, which originated, as the dramatic ones usually do, from the gas station on Route 9, she had touched him. None of those versions were entirely wrong. What actually happened was this. Willa had not gone out there with a plan. She had gone out there because she couldn't sleep, and the coffee was done, and the house was too quiet. In the way that empty houses become quiet after a person who filled them is gone, not just silent, but hollow, like a bell that's lost its clapper. She had been standing at the kitchen window looking at the east pasture, and she had thought about Boyd, standing at that fence, evening after evening, and she had thought, "What were you doing out there?" And she had pulled on her boots and gone to find out. She did not bring a lead rope. She did not bring a halter. She brought nothing but herself, which in retrospect was either the wisest or most reckless decision, depending on who you asked. She went through the gate and latched it behind her. Crestfall was at the far end of the pasture, maybe 150 yards away, standing sideways to her in the way horses do when they are watching you without appearing to. His ears were forward, his tail lifted once, then settled. Willa stopped just inside the gate and stood still. She had grown up in suburban Ohio. She had not been a horse person before Boyd. She had learned, over 37 years, the basic vocabulary of being around large animals, when to move slowly, when to stand still, when to look away. But she had never pretended to have any particular gift for it. That had been Boyd's territory. She stood inside the gate for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. Crestfall did not move. After a while she sat down, not dramatically, not with any intention. Her knees had been bothering her lately, and the ground was dry, and she simply sat down, cross-legged in the grass, the way she might have sat down in her own backyard 30 years ago. She was 61 years old, and she was sitting in a field with a dangerous horse, and she felt for the first time since February something that wasn't grief. She wasn't sure what it was yet. She just knew it wasn't grief. Crestfall's head came up. Both ears trained on her now, sharp and focused, the way a horse processes something that doesn't fit the pattern it expects. A person sitting on the ground is not a threat shape. It is not a running shape or a reaching shape. It is an unfamiliar shape, and unfamiliar is not the same as dangerous. He did not come closer, but he turned to face her. She stayed for 40 minutes. When she stood up to leave, her knees ached, and there was grass on the back of her jeans, and Crestfall was standing 30 yards closer than he'd been when she sat down. She hadn't seen him move. He'd just arrived, the way horses do when they decide to close distance without admitting they're doing it. She latched the gate behind her and walked back to the house. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She went back the next morning. Cutler saw her go in the second time. He was driving past on the county road, slowed down, and watched for a moment through his windshield before pulling over entirely and getting out of his truck. She was sitting down again. The black horse was at maybe 60 yards, closer than the day before. Cutler stood at the fence for a while. He was a practical man, not an unkind one, but practical in the way that ranchers in hard country often are, which means he measured things by their outcome and distrusted what he could not explain. He had been one of the men who told Boyd, when Boyd first brought the horse home, that the animal was more trouble than it was worth. He watched Willa sit in the field. He watched the horse stand 40 yards from her without blowing or stamping or presenting any of the behaviors he'd come to associate with Crestfall. He shook his head slowly. Then he got back in his truck and drove to the feed store, where he told 2 people what he'd seen, and from there the information did what information does. By the end of the week, Willa had received 3 phone calls from people she didn't know well. One from a woman named Orla, who ran the local extension office and wanted to make sure she understood the risks. One from a man named Sewell, who had horses of his own, and asked if she needed a professional to come assess the animal, and one from her daughter Nadine, who had clearly been called by someone in town and was now calling from Portland with a voice pitched 3 notes higher than usual. "Mom, people are saying you're going into the pasture with that horse." "I am." "Mom." "Nadine." A silence. "Are you okay?" Nadine asked. The question had layers. Willa understood all of them. "I don't know yet," Willa said, "but I think I might be getting there." She went in every morning. Sometimes she sat, sometimes she stood. On the 5th day, she brought a book. Not to read, just to hold, because having something in her hands made her feel less self-conscious about the nothing she was doing. She didn't read a word. She just sat in the field with the book in her lap and crestfall at 40 yards, and the Montana sky doing what Montana skies do in April, which is change every 20 minutes like it can't make up its mind. On the 7th day, he walked to within 15 yards of her and stopped. She didn't move. She didn't look directly at him. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, the way she'd seen Boyd do at the fence. Not avoiding, just not pressing. She could hear him breathing. She could feel the specific, particular weight of being close to something large and alive and unresolved. And she realized, sitting there in the grass, that this was exactly what grief felt like. Not the crying part, not the casserole part. This part, this sitting in proximity to something that could hurt you, that you could not control, that you could not fix, that you just had to be near and wait. She understood for the first time what Boyd had been doing at that fence every evening. He hadn't been trying to tame the horse. He had been practicing something else entirely. On the 8th day, Crestfall walked to 10 yards and lowered his head. News of what was happening on the Garnet property spread through Harlan Creek with the particular velocity of things that people don't quite believe but can't stop repeating. Some of it was admiring, some of it was worried. A notable portion of it was the kind of thing people say when they've decided a person has lost their grip on good judgment and need to be protected from themselves. Cutler came by personally. He stood at the gate and watched for a while and then said carefully, "Willa, that horse is not a project." "I know," she said. "He's not going to become something different because you sit near him." "I know that too." He looked at the horse. He looked at her. "Then what are you doing?" She thought about it. "I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that would make sense to you." Cutler was a man who respected honesty even when it inconvenienced him. He nodded once and left. The person who understood most clearly, or at least claimed to, was an older woman named Saoirse, who had lived outside of Harlan Creek for 40 years, in a small house on the backside of the ridge, and was generally described by the community as particular, which is the polite word for a woman who has strong opinions and doesn't much care about softening them. Saoirse had known Boyd. More specifically, she had known Boyd's father, who had been a horseman of some reputation in the valley 2 generations back. She showed up one afternoon while Willa was in the pasture and sat herself down on the fence rail with the comfort of someone who has decided she belongs wherever she happens to be. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched. Then she said, "He's deciding." Willa looked over at her. "What?" "The horse. He's deciding about you. That's all this is." Saoirse pulled a piece of grass from the fence post and turned it between her fingers. Most people can't stand that part, the deciding. They try to speed it up, give it treats, talk at it, reach out too early, and the horse learns that humans don't know how to wait, and it stops trusting. "Boyd used to stand at the fence," Willa said. "I know, saw him plenty of times. Your Boyd understood something most people don't." Saoirse looked at the horse. "This animal's been pushed too hard by too many people who thought speed was the same as progress. He's not mean. He's just done being lied to." Willa turned that over slowly. Lied to. Every time a human moves faster than the animal is ready for, it's a lie. You're saying with your body that you're safe, and then proving with your actions that you're not. Saoirse got down from the fence. You're not lying to him. That's why he's getting closer. She left without saying goodbye, which Willa later learned was typical. That evening, Willa looked up Crestfall's history as thoroughly as she could. She found the name of the trainer in Billings, who had surrendered him, a man named Gage, who turned out to have a website and a phone number. She called. He picked up on the third ring. When she explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a silence on the other end. I heard Boyd passed, Gage said finally. I'm sorry for that. Thank you. I'm trying to understand the horse. Another silence. What do you want to know? What happened to him? Before you? Gage was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, he was in a training facility out east. Competition bloodlines, high expectations. He didn't take to the pressure. The way they described it to me, he'd been forced into things too fast, too rough, too early. By the time I got him, he didn't trust a hand reaching toward him. Didn't trust stillness. Didn't trust noise. Didn't trust much of anything. But Boyd was different, Gage said. I never understood exactly what Boyd did, but whatever it was the right thing. Willa thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. Didn't trust stillness. She thought about that. She thought about how, for the last 10 years or so, she and Boyd had been so busy with the business of living, the cattle, the finances, the children, the house, the 10,000 small negotiations that make up a long marriage, that she had stopped being still with him, not because she didn't love him, because there was always something to do next. She wondered quietly if that had been a lie too, not to the horse, to Boyd. By the end of April, Crestfall would stand within arm's reach. Willa had not touched him. She had not tried. She understood, in a way she could not have articulated 3 weeks earlier, that the reaching was his to do, not hers. She was there. She was consistent. She was honest. That was the whole of what she had to offer. But the community's patience, the part that was watching anyway, was running shorter than hers. A man named Obi, who sat on the county board of supervisors and prided himself on being reasonable, had a conversation with her at the post office that Willa would later describe as well-intentioned and completely wrong. He suggested gently that the horse represented a liability, that given the history of incidents, given that Willa was alone on the property, given the circumstances, he said circumstances in a way that meant your grief without wanting to say it directly, it might be wise to let someone with more experience make a decision about Crestfall's future. Willa thanked him. She did not agree with him. Radford, one of the brothers who had come by early on and left quickly, came back alone on a Wednesday and leaned on the fence for a while. He watched Crestfall standing near Willa with his head dropped and his eyes half closed in the way of a horse at ease. I'll be damned, Radford said quietly. He's not tame, Willa said from inside the pasture. I want to be clear about that. No, he's not. Radford studied the horse. But he's not what he was either. He's exactly what he was. I'm just letting him be it. Radford chewed on that. He was a man who understood horses better than he understood people, and what he was seeing did not fit the categories he'd been given. He said, "What are you going to do with him long term?" It was the question everyone was dancing around. The property taxes were due. The other 3 horses were manageable, but they were a cost. Willa had Boyd's pension and the sale proceeds from the cattle operation, and she was not in immediate difficulty, but the mathematics of a woman alone on a working property have a patience of their own. I don't know yet, she said. Fair enough. Radford left and did not come back to bother her about it again, which she respected. The person who came back most often, unexpectedly, was Saoirse. She would appear on the fence in the afternoons with no announcement and no explanation, sit for a while, and then leave. She rarely said much. Once she brought a thermos of coffee and passed it through the fence railing and said, "Thought you might be cold." and that was the extent of it. One afternoon, Willa asked her, "Did you know Boyd was doing this? Before he got sick, I mean. Did you understand what he was working on with the horse?" Saoirse looked at her for a long moment. "I knew what he was working on. I wasn't sure it was the horse." Willa didn't ask what she meant. She thought she understood. On May 3rd, a Tuesday, she remembered the day clearly because it was exactly 3 months after she had found Boyd in the barn. Crestfall walked up to her while she was standing and touched his nose to her hand. He held it there for 4 seconds. Then he stepped back. Willa stood completely still. She was aware that she was holding her breath. She was aware that her eyes were burning. She was aware in a way that was almost physical of how much she wanted to reach back. She kept her hand exactly where it was. She let him choose. He stepped forward again. He let her hand rest against the side of his face. She did not cry until she was back inside the house. What happened in the second week of May was not something Willa had planned. Most of the things that matter, she had found, weren't. It started with a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. The man on the other end identified himself as Decker. He gave just the last name, the way professional men sometimes do when they've decided they don't need to introduce themselves with the ordinary courtesies. He said he represented a group of investors who had purchased a facility outside Whitefish and were developing a performance horse operation, and that he had heard about a black Andalusian cross on the Garnet property and was interested in discussing acquisition. He used the word acquisition. Willa said she wasn't interested. Decker said he hadn't mentioned a price yet. She said the price wasn't the issue. He mentioned a number anyway. It was a significant number. It was the kind of number that changes the arithmetic of things. Willa thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then she went to the east pasture. Crestfall was already at the gate when she got there. He had begun doing this, coming to meet her in the mornings, sometime in the last 10 days, and every time it happened, she felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She went through the gate. He turned and walked beside her, not because she asked him to, not because she was leading him, but because he chose to. They walked the length of the pasture together, the woman and the horse, and the morning light came in low and gold, the way it does in Montana in May, when the world is deciding again to be beautiful. She told him about the phone call. She understood perfectly well that he did not understand what she was saying. She told him anyway. She told him about Decker and the number and the word acquisition, and the way some people look at a living thing and see only what it can be made to produce. He walked beside her and did not offer an opinion. "I'm not selling you," she said. She heard herself say it, and she realized it was the first time she had made a clear decision about anything since Boyd died. Not a passive decision. Not the absence of an action, but an actual choice made with her whole self, standing in a field in the morning. The next day, Cutler called. Decker had called him too, apparently, had asked around about who might be in a position to advise Willa on the matter. Cutler, to his credit, had called Willa to tell her before doing anything else. "He implied you might be having trouble managing things alone," Cutler said. "I am managing things alone. That's different from having trouble." "I know it." A pause. "I told him you didn't need advice." "Thank you." "I also told him the horse would probably put him through a fence, which is true." Willa almost laughed. It was the first time in 3 months she had come close. Also true, what happened 3 days after that was the thing that became the story everyone told. Decker came himself. He arrived in a truck that cost more than most people's houses and got out wearing clothes that made clear he had spent time around horses, but not the kind of time that gets you dirty. He walked to the fence of the east pasture and stood there in the attitude of a man who has decided he will obtain what he came for. Willa met him at the fence. He made his case. He said the horse was dangerous and underdeveloped. He said she was a widow with property she couldn't manage. He said he could have papers drawn up by the end of the week. He said all of this with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned that enough money and enough certainty will eventually produce what you're after. Willa listened to all of it. Then she turned and walked through the gate into the pasture. Crestfall was 40 yards out. He turned when she entered, the way he always did now. He watched her. She walked to the center of the pasture and stopped. Crestfall walked to her. He did it in that way he had, unhurried, deliberate, like a decision being made step by step. He walked to her and stood beside her, his shoulder warm against her arm, his head dropping slightly in that way that horses communicate ease. She stood there, with her hand resting on his neck. Decker at the fence said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How?" Not as a question, just the word. "He's not a problem to be solved," Willa said. He never was. Decker watched them for another moment. Then he got back in his truck. He did not draw up any papers. He left. Saoirse, who had apparently been on the fence the whole time, and neither of them had noticed, waited until the truck was gone, and then said, "Well, that's that." Willa looked over at her. "Were you here the whole time?" "Long enough." Saoirse climbed down from the fence with the stiffness of a woman in her 70s and brushed her hands on her jeans. Boyd would have liked that. Willa turned that over quietly. "You think?" "I know." Saoirse began walking toward the road. He used to say the best thing you could do for something frightened was just stay. Most people leave. The ones who stay are the ones worth something. She didn't turn around. He wasn't only talking about the horse. Willa stood in the east pasture with her hand on Crestfall's neck until the sound of Saoirse's car had faded, and there was nothing left but the wind and the grass, and the particular silence of a Montana afternoon. She stayed. June came, and with it the kind of warmth that makes Montana people forgive the winter. Willa's daughter Nadine flew out again, this time without the frantic energy of the first visit. She landed in Billings and drove the 2 hours to Harlan Creek and arrived on a Thursday afternoon to find her mother in the east pasture, walking beside a black horse that had been, until recently, the most feared animal in the county. Nadine stood at the fence for a long time. "Mom," she finally said, "come through the gate." The horse, come through the gate, Nadine." Nadine came through the gate. She stood at the edge of the pasture with her arms close to her body, the posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. Crestfall looked at her. His ears went forward. He was assessing. "Don't stare at him," Willa said. "Look at the ground just off to the side." Nadine looked at the ground just off to the side. "Now just breathe," Nadine breathed. Or tried to. Crestfall took 3 steps toward her and stopped. He held that distance. He was not welcoming and he was not threatening. He was simply present, which Willa had come to understand was the most honest thing a horse could be. "He's beautiful," Nadine said. Her voice had gone quiet. "He is. Dad brought him home." "He did." Nadine was quiet for a while. She looked at the horse and she looked at her mother and she said, "Are you okay, Mom? Actually okay?" Willa considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I think I'm learning something," she said. "I don't know if that's the same as okay, but it's something." Word had circulated by then about the encounter with Decker. The community's opinion, which had been divided on Willa's daily pasture visits, shifted perceptibly after that. The quality of the shift was hard to articulate precisely, but Willa felt it in the way people greeted her at the hardware store and the post office. There was something like respect in it, not the sympathetic kind that people extend to widows, the genuine kind. Radford's brother, the other one, whose name was Larch, stopped by and asked straightforwardly if she'd ever considered boarding horses. He had a mare he needed to place for the summer, and he said he'd rather have her here than anywhere else in the county. "I'll think about it," Willa said. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she said yes. It was the beginning of something she had not planned, which is the only way anything worthwhile ever seems to begin. By September, Willa Garnett had 2 boarded horses in addition to her own 4, a part-time working arrangement with a younger woman named Petra, who had grown up on a ranch outside Livingston and needed flexible work while she figured out what she was doing with her life, and a reputation in the surrounding 3 counties that she had not sought and did not entirely know what to do with. People came to watch. She didn't invite them, but she didn't turn them away. There was a woman from over in Cascade County who showed up one morning with a horse trailer and a quarter-horse gelding who had, according to the woman, been ruined by a previous owner. The woman's name was Rowena, and she stood at the fence with her hat in her hands in the way of someone who has run out of other options. Willa looked at the horse. She looked at the woman. "Leave him for 2 weeks," she said. "Come back and see." Rowena left him. Willa did not do anything remarkable with him. She did what she had done with Crestfall. She was present, she was consistent, she did not lie with her body. She sat in the pasture in the mornings. She let the horse be what it was. She waited. In 2 weeks, the gelding was a different animal, not broken in and not transformed, just less afraid, less braced against the world. Rowena came back and cried at the fence. Saoirse came to visit on an afternoon in late September and sat on her usual fence rail and watched Willa move through the east pasture with Crestfall walking 3 feet off her shoulder, unharnessed, uncommanded, choosing to be there. "You know people are going to start calling you something," Saoirse said. "I already know what they're calling me." "Does it bother you?" Willa thought about Boyd at the fence in the evenings, about what he had been practicing, about what he had been trying to learn how to do. She thought about sitting down in the grass the first morning, not because she was wise, but because her knees hurt and she didn't know what else to do. She thought about the 4 seconds Crestfall's nose had rested against her hand. "No," she said, "it doesn't bother me." Nadine called every Sunday now, not with worry in her voice, with curiosity. She asked about the horses, about Petra, about Saoirse, about what it was like to be there going into the second winter. She asked questions that were really asking, "Are you still there? Are you still you? Is there still a you to be?" Willa answered them all honestly. Yes, yes, yes. She still went to the east pasture every morning. Crestfall was always at the gate. She thought sometimes that Boyd had known this would happen. Not the specific details, not Decker, not Rowena, not any of it, but the general shape of it, the thing that the horse needed and the thing that she would eventually need to give. She thought Boyd had brought Crestfall home not because he believed he could fix the animal, but because he knew, in the quiet way he knew most things, that the animal was a kind of lesson, something that could not be rushed or forced or acquired. Something that required a person to become still enough and honest enough and patient enough that the frightened thing would choose of its own will to draw close. He had been teaching her. He had just run out of time to explain it. She stood at the gate in the September morning, and Crestfall stood on the other side, and she unlatched it, and he stepped aside to let her through, the way he always did. That small courtesy, that choice, that daily declaration of the thing they had arrived at together. She walked into the pasture. He fell into step beside her. The sky was the color of something beginning. People in Harlan Creek will tell you this story in different ways, depending on who they are. Some will say it's a story about a woman and a horse, and it is that. Some will say it's a story about grief, about what happens to a person when they lose the one they built their life with and have to figure out what remains. And it's that too. But I think it's something else underneath all of those things. I think it's a story about what patience actually is. Not waiting, not endurance. Patience as an act, as a daily choice to show up, to be still, to not demand that something frightened reorganize itself on your schedule. Willa didn't tame that horse. She earned his trust. Those are not the same thing. And I keep thinking about what Saoirse said at the end, about how Boyd wasn't only talking about the horse when he talked about staying, about how the ones who stay are the ones worth something. I'd like to think that's true. I'd like to think that showing up day after day for the frightened and the difficult and the unresolved, in all the forms that takes, is one of the most important things a person can do. Willa Garnett opened a gate. Nobody else would. What she found on the other side was something she didn't know she was looking for. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever stayed when it would have been easier to leave. I'll see you in the next one.